Other things that move right around the triangle would be masks. Masks have been long art traditions that moves right around the triangle. Slaves would have brought these on ships, as well as they would have still have in their minds how to create them. So some of them were even created back in the West Indies, as well as sailors at the time who were moving from England into West Africa were doing bartering, and some of the arts that were bartered for, like the gunpowder, the guns and cutleries that had moved from England into West Africa, were traded for things like masts. I want to point out to you two important things here about this mask. One is this white color under the eyes. These were used by the slaves as some kind of mystic to communicate to their ancestral. And the other thing about this mask, when it was worn like this over the face, it was said that the mask became alive. There was some mystical or some mysticism that the wearer would believe, and hence him or her would have acted a certain way. So this had some livity, some life to it at a particular time. It was two things. It was used for ceremonies, special ceremonies, as well as for celebration. Back then, the slaves had two opportunities to celebrate. At the end of a crop, which was somewhere around the end of November, they would have an opportunity, while they were still slaves, to have their free dancing and their merrymaking, and mask wearing was an important part of their art and their artwork as people. So they made masks, as well as some of these masks were brought in by sailors themselves, because the slavers saw some of these things, probably didn't understand what they were, but they were works of art, and they brought them back to their great houses, and they had them there. And some of them were stolen during times of riot. You have a few good house slaves who probably one or two of these would be loaned to wear to these celebrations. And more than often, the majority of them would have been made out of quite a few things: paper, cloth, wood, but they were primarily these wood that they were made out of. Carnival was one of the invisible cargo, because many people tend to think it's just physical thing that moved during the triangle trade. Carnival was one of the celebration that moved from Africa to the West Indies and back to Europe. And the significance of this photograph here is that Carnival then had always had two central leaders, and their costume were far more than clothing. They were items demonstrating cultures, communication tools to their ancestors, as well as, importantly, showing that these festivals are more than just celebrating. They were celebrating specific and times where they would have reflected on their history, and particular paying homage to their ancestors. That was what Carnival meant to them. It was a merrymaking, but it was also a spiritual connection that was a part of it.
To their ancestors.
To their ancestors. Bananas move extensively through Europe and the Caribbean. This shot is demonstrating primarily that the bananas then were ripe mainly before they were put on the ships. And what you would have here, the whole banana plant fruit here would be taken from the field, hung by a rope into a closed place away from rain, but sunlight would be okay to reach them, and then these fruits will be ripened before they are taken here. So they were actually ripened, and this was the mechanism used to ripe these bananas and the bananas formed that central part of the trade, other than just sugar, which we thought came to Europe. Bananas were coming as part of the cargo there.
I mean, how long did the actual trip take on average to come from west coast of Africa?
The average trip would be 6 weeks, and it depending on the number of slaves in each ship. But on average, most statisticians say an average ship which has about 440, 460 slaves, we are looking at about 6 weeks sailing. Yeah, barring there is no interruption of riots on the ships, because that would have delayed, because by then they would have navigation of those ships and weather conditions were pretty much mapped out basically, and ships could have dealt with those. But many times ships were delayed because of riots. There were a lot of riots on these ships. Yeah.
That's not that well known, is it?
That's not well known, yeah.
But how did those normally end up with a kind of a brutal repressive?
Yeah. Most of the time, suicide, those who couldn't bother to revolt, they would have killed themselves. Many parents kill their children because children were also kidnapped during the slavery. Some of the sailors reacted brutally. The most celebrated case is the Zong experience, where this ship by the name of Zong, there was a riot on board, and the sailor threw off 155 slaves, I think, to manage that riot, because there was so much. You may be asking, how comes they were in chains and at their knuckles and their hands, and they were able to riot it? Two things happened. One is that during exercise, taking them from where they were and taking them on board for sunlight and exercise, slaves usually tore apart bits and pieces of boards and metals from the ship and used them as weapons. And they were those who were able to use just the shackles that they had to fight with, because if you notice, some of them were elongated, some of them were short, as well as it is not well discussed in the literature. That it's something I'm not very much believe, that some of them had tools to eat with, knives and forks. And there was something I read in one book where at one time they had forgotten to take the knives from them. Well, I just found that unbelievable. That was how the rioting started, as well as on the point of just disembarking, it took them like a week to prepare the slaves. They were on ships for soap, so there are times when they would take them off, take those chains them off, oil them, and during the process of doing that, many of them would riot. So the Zong case, these slaves were thrown aboard alive, and it became a very big case in the courts of England here. Okay. The other item I would like to focus on is, this is a game. It was invented by a king around 6,000 years BC in Sudan. It was thought that this game would provide an instrument for the warring tribes to play and to understand more about different tribes, because there were a lot of tribals, fractions. So the king thought he could use a game whereby they could play together and hence don't have to go to war. It is known as the Wari. It was also used in the Nile by mathematicians and accountants, because it's the accounting system where you use pebbles from one hole to the next, and it has something to do, if you capture more than this person who's over this size, you have their slaves and they become your own, and so it surrounds the whole slavery thing. But it is now quite a popular game right across the world. It first entered into Barbados in the late 1700s, when it was the height of Britain sailing into the West Indies with ships, and this was brought in by a sailor, according to the literature, and so they were probably the ones who played it. So it was introduced as part of the cargo, then and there, the Wari game.